Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's always an honour for me to rise in this House to speak on important national debates. And the threat to Canada posed by ISIS, or ISIL, Madam Speaker, is one of those issues facing Canada and facing our Parliament. In fact, this is my fourth speech in the House on this issue, and I divide my time with the honourable member from York Simcoe. In the first debate on this issue, Madam Speaker, that the previous government brought to this House, the Prime Minister, who was then the third-party leader, laid out 4 elements that the Liberal Party would consider in deploying the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I have to say at the outset, Madam Speaker, all members of this House are tremendously proud of the professionalism and dedication to service of our men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces, Madam Speaker. It's a given. I'm fortunate to meet and speak with all of them, given my former role and given my 12 years wearing the uniform of our country. So thank you to the people, even those on their way home, for what you've done. We're all very proud of you. And the debates here in no way diminish that pride of anyone in this House, I would think, Madam Speaker. But at that time, the Prime Minister, who was then the third-party leader, laid out 4 criteria. First, that Canada would have was there a role to play in the threat? 2, was there a clear mission and a clear role? 3, was there a clear and transparent debate? And 4, how could Canada best help in this international mission? Well, let's look at those things, Madam Speaker. In his speech in this House last week, the Prime Minister said that ISIS is a direct threat to Canadians. And that is when we deploy our military, Madam Speaker, when there is a threat to Canada or our allies or our values around the world. But in this case, the Prime Minister agrees it's a direct threat to Canadians, and we've seen that, Madam Speaker. So second, is there a clear mission and role? Yes, there was. The previous government, Madam Speaker, in conjunction with our allies, brought that clear mission and role to the House. The airstrike mission that our 6 CF-18's have been participating in has been tremendously successful. With our allies, we've limited ISIS to about 25% of the territory they once held. We've weakened them, we've degraded them, and that's why, in fact, our allies are stepping it up, because there have been success with this clear mission that Canada was until the Prime Minister's election promise pulled us out of. We were part of that clear mission. Third, clear and transparent debate, Madam Speaker. Well, we're failing on that rung as well. The F-18s are already en route back home. We're still debating this in this Parliament. So it's actually not a transparent debate when the government had already said originally that today was going to be the last day, actually, February 22nd. But we learned last week the final mission was flown and our men and women are on their way back home before we've even finished a debate in this place. They're not even meeting their own standard, Madam Speaker. Canadians expect more, and particularly our men and women in uniform who can't speak up with respect to their opinion, expect the debate to at least be completed and voted on before we hightail out of a fight our allies are still in. And how can we best help was the 4th pillar. And that's what I'm going to spend a few moments on, Madam Speaker, because I've heard ridiculous statements in this place that only Canadians are uniquely suited to provide humanitarian aid or training. Well, the United States military would probably train more people in their own armed forces in 1 year than we could ever possibly train in the next 2 decades. Our allies in NATO and other countries are equally as professional in the training. So we were playing that role before, we're going to continue to play that role, but suggesting that's the only role Canada is uniquely suited to is just disingenuous, Madam Speaker. We're also one of the largest per capita aid donors, but you can't deliver aid until there's stability. That's why military force is required at times, Madam Speaker, to bring that stability so that humanitarian assistance can reach the people it needs to reach. And so we haven't had a clear and transparent debate, and we're not helping in the way we could. Our men and women of the Royal Canadian Air Force are some of the best pilots and air crew and technicians in the world. We have a history from the early days of World War I and Billy Bishop to today, Madam Speaker, of being some of the best and most professional in the world. And what most professional means is that we assess our missions to make sure that strikes are appropriate and that there's minimal collateral damage. we're able to interoperably work with our allies, namely the Americans, the British, and some of the other participants. We seamlessly operate with them as members of not only NATO, but of our closest allies in the Five Eyes relationship. This is an area where Canada is uniquely suited to play a role to ensure there is no collateral damage or death, Madam Speaker. I'll quote a U.S. Marine Corps general last year who said on the Canadian participation, Brigadier General Wieldley, the CF-18 warplanes are, quote, an absolutely capable platform in this environment. They provide a great deal of flexibility in the ordnance they can carry in order to address different targets. They have a tremendous array of sensors and data sharing capabilities, unquote, Madam Speaker. We are used to working alongside our allies. Canada is never usually the first nation in, Madam Speaker. But when our friends or our values are at risk, we're always, or have been in the past, always standing alongside our allies and can work with them better than any other nation. So the previous government launched us on a training, aid, and military force with our allies' mission. So, Madam Speaker, this debate really is not about increasing the number of trainers. It's not about increasing the amount of aid. I'm sure this debate was coming to the House anyway because our previous government set a timeline. We probably would have bumped those numbers up too, Madam Speaker. So this debate rests solely on the decision to withdraw from the active combat role in this mission at a time when our allies are stepping up. And that leads me to the subject of my previous 3 speeches in this place and an essay I wrote online that was called "The World Needs More Canada," Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker. Our foreign policy since our early days have been to align our interests on the security of our country, threats to our allies, and to promote values and human rights and security for others around the world. And I've quoted so many Liberals lately, Madam Speaker, that some of my colleagues may start questioning my conservative bona fides. But I'm using those examples to underscore how this was never something that was a conservative versus Liberal proposition, Madam Speaker. This was an essential vote that usually Parliament was unanimous on because it was greater than ourselves. Mackenzie King said within Canadians there lied a deep-seated instinct for freedom. Pearson said that whether a Canadian fired their rifle in Korea or in Germany, they were protecting Canadians just as if they fired their rifle here at home. That's what our crews have been doing in their sorties, Madam Speaker. I quoted John Manley and his inspirational words after the 9/11 attacks, saying, "You just need to look to the cemeteries of Europe to see if Canada's history is one of taking an active role." So today I'll continue in that vein and quote a few others. Lloyd Axworthy last year said how disappointed he was about the then third-party leader's position. He said, I quote, "You've got to realize that diplomatic niceties are not going to work. Humanitarian aid is not going to work if people are going to be shot in their beds. At times, you have to toughen up." I hope the Prime Minister is calling Mr. Axworthy, who was our Foreign Affairs Minister during the Kosovo airstrikes of 1999. Last week, Madam Speaker, I spoke with a Canadian veteran who fought as a CF-18 pilot in those Kosovo missions. And you know what I was struck by, Madam Speaker? In Kosovo, the Liberal mission, we flew 2% of the sorties. And we were the 4th or 5th largest overall contributor to the airstrike mission. What are the numbers over the last year, Madam Speaker? We flew 2% of the sorties, and we were the 4th or 5th largest contributor. That is our role. That is our traditional role, Madam Speaker. Art Eggleton, who was Minister of Defence at that time, said about Kosovo, quote, "It's in every way consistent with our traditional approach to international security threats and protection of human rights." And what did their boss, Madam Speaker, my old legal colleague, Prime Minister Chrétien, said about the Kosovo airstrike mission? He said, I quote, we have entered into the campaign to stop President Milosevic and the ethnic cleansing, raping and murdering that is going on. However, we are a member of a team, and as a member of the team, we've agreed on a strategy that the best way to resolve this was the use of airstrikes. That is what is going on. So, Madam Speaker, the final quote is now from the now Minister of Immigration, who said in 2002, So what does sovereignty mean in the context of being Minister of Defence? And I'll be finished shortly. It means that our government must be able to deploy forces overseas to reflect Canadian priorities and values to help Canada achieve its foreign policy objectives. Those objectives have been sound throughout our history until this debate, Madam Speaker. I hope the government sees the light. Thank you very much.